capital to invest in a business. And so it's a different experience of where you can define how the business works, do a lot of the business development, and then have people in place, specialist people that you're employing to run the business on your behalf.
Yeah, and that capital doesn't need to be big. I mean, you could literally just get yourself a virtual assistant just to do, the $5 jobs. You can just literally identify how you as the solopreneur, how you're spending your time, where is it really not that necessary, and then putting a VA in place.
Mm-hmm.
But the process of getting the right person with the right skill, that's a whole thing on its own. So I think, and that is something that nobody teaches you either. It's something that you kind of have to figure out. So one of the things I've started to implement is to use psychometric tools in order to help me to decide on which candidate to choose for the job. And so you can probably tell us a little bit about personality types and what we should be looking at when we're looking at getting team members on board.
So taking a step back, the first thing is to always identify what does your business do and what kind of people do you need in your business in order to achieve that. And there are different tasks within the business that certain people will do better than others. Mm-hmm. And so it's first being quite clear around what are those roles that you are trying to fill and what kind of people do they require. So on the one hand, we often recruit for skills and experience in terms of doing the actual task, but we don't always think about how should the person behave in that particular task. So for example, if you want someone who's highly technical, has high attention to detail, you're not necessarily going to employ someone who's very extroverted and likes to socialize with people. You would probably choose someone who's more introverted and more task oriented for that particular role. So it's very important to understand it's not just someone's degree or their level of training and how many years have they been in a position for before you employ them. It's actually understanding more of the qualitative components of the role and then employing someone who has those qualitative abilities or behavioral aspects. And then on top of that, it's also to understand what the culture of your organization is. And that's often based on who the business owner is as a person. What do you want your business to represent in the market? And so it's also employing people who have the same passion, the same sort of soulful experience of the work, the way that you would do it. And so it's assessing for those things as well. And some psychometric tests can actually facilitate that. There are loads of different assessments that you can use. Some that actually measure aptitude. So someone might have really good maths marks, but can they think laterally and can they think on the spot? Can they make decisions easily? They might be very clever or book smart, but can they be flexible and can they think out of the box? Can they, in a moment, make a decision when you're not there? So those are the kinds of things you want to test for depending on the role. In terms of personality, there are also multiple different tools. And it's useful to work with someone who is trained again in that and who specializes in those particular tools. So there are lots of industrial psychologists and psychometrists who can facilitate that, and that's what they specialize in. So I usually recommend that one uses people like that.
So one of the things that I found interesting when I started to use these tests was that I would be interviewing someone on a video, so it was remote interviews, and they came across to me in one way, and then the psychometric testing just confirmed. For example, I'm thinking one person in particular, her psychometric testing was perfect for the role, but when I was interviewing her, she was so nervous that I was hesitant to employ her because I just thought you need to be able to at least be questioned about how you perform and what you do and what you think about your profession and all that kind of stuff. So I found that really odd, how the testing was so like it was an excellent match, but the in-person match was not necessarily. So what recommendations would you have in those instances?
So recruitment is quite a process, and I think sometimes people think, okay, I have I have a vacancy, I quickly need to find someone. So I go through the, steps of like put an ad out, get some CVs, scan the CVs, do a psychometric test, do an interview, and hopefully, that recipe should result in a perfect candidate. But the reality is that recruitment, if done well, is actually more of an iterative process. So most people recruit on demand, as in, I've already lost the employee and suddenly I need to find someone. And that's a reactive way of recruiting, which means we're often desperate, we're often looking for whatever's left in the market at that moment in time. And so we're actually, even in terms of the pool of candidates that are coming to us, we're not necessarily getting the best quality. And so the ideal in every business is that we're more proactive in our approach and in our system of thinking about recruiting. And that's again where strategy is so important, is to go every quarter I'm thinking about what might my business need over the next quarter. And so I think about what's going on with my talent pool, what's going on with the operations of my business. Am I seeing an uptick in demand? Could I be expecting I need more resources to service this demand? So planning and thinking about potential shifts in the business allows you to be more proactive.
Yeah.
And so I often encourage business owners to think about your talent pool, your talent pipeline, just like we would be thinking about our customer pipeline. We have to be thinking about inflows and outflows on both ends of the spectrum. And so just like we're constantly looking for new leads for our sales pipeline, we actually also should be constantly looking for leads when it comes to our business. And so I always have a radar up in my mind around, am I meeting someone that could potentially be a good fit for my business? And if not, should I be doing something to keep that sort of talent pool open all the time? And so recruitment should actually be an ongoing process in our business, and creating almost like a database of potential employees who you're building a relationship with all the time, just like we're doing that with our sales leads for our customers. And so I think of marketing and recruitment in the same way. We both market for our customers and for our employees, which again speaks to the culture that we're building in the organization. We're building a culture internally as much as we're building a culture externally. And how do we make sure that both of those are being thought about? So that's more philosophical, but practically speaking, what you're asking is, how do I know whether this is a good candidate or not? And a good candidate is one that you've dated, as opposed to a one-night stand, right? Yeah. You don't marry someone after meeting them at the bar. I mean, some people do, but mostly it doesn't end well. So we want to think about the employment relationship is like a big commitment you're making. And so you want to think about that commitment in terms of the way that you would if you're signing an antenuptial contract with someone. It's an important decision, and so it takes time. It takes multiple locations, dating them and seeing them with their family and seeing them at a sports club, and the same thing applies to employment. And so, yes, put out an ad. Yes, get a CV. Yes, do psychometrics. Yes, do an interview, but one of the really useful techniques is actually a group interview. So we often ask multiple candidates to come into the room at the same time, and then we ask questions to try and identify how they respond, who puts up their hand first, who shouts out, who holds back. So you see a different dynamic in a group context. So you'll quickly be able to pick up who's more of an introvert, who's more anxious. And again, performance anxiety is a thing. And so it's not something to necessarily exclude a candidate because they have performance anxiety. It's to note that and go, identify that this person has performance anxiety. Either that means they're a perfectionist and they really like to get things right, or they are just generally anxious and they need a very secure environment to operate in. And often those types are actually really good employees, because once they feel safe and they can, be loyal within that environment, they they're reliable employees. So it's not necessarily a deterrent. But I think all of this to say is that it's a very dynamic thing. It's not a static, linear thing. Recruiting someone takes a lot of thought. And so it means being mindful of why you're recruiting, when you're recruiting, how you're recruiting, and whether it's proactive or reactive.
Yeah. And so the lesson learned from how long it takes to recruit people. And so I've got a business that's quite specialized, and it takes me a long time to train the person. So I've now extended my notice period because it takes me that much longer to find the right person. So then you can adapt to, you can adapt your setup and your contracts and things like that to make sure that the business can keep running and you can do your recruiting properly. That's the important part.
I mean, that's also a complicated thing because notice periods, legally speaking, there's a whole lot of stuff around that. But it's really important to build relationship with your employee and build loyalty with them. And so that also comes into how do you define your employee value proposition? What do employees get from joining your team or your workplace? But I think it's really important to spend time thinking about what is it that you need your employee to be. And if you start your business being the one that's doing everything and your business grows as a result of your input, often what we're looking for is clones of ourselves. And that's a really difficult thing because there is no one just like you. And so how do you accommodate for diversity within your business and strength that doesn't look like your strength? And how do we begin to tap into the potential and the skills and the talents of the people within our teams and accommodate for their quirks and their differences? And again, that means running a dynamic system, which requires enormous intuition from the leader, from the business owner, enormous flexibility internally, as opposed to a very rigid, this is how the organization must work. One of the businesses I've worked with is run by a very rigid, very structured business owner, and he's built a very mechanical organization. And so it's interesting how it's attracted very mechanical people who are very compliant, who obey the rules and who are extremely loyal. And so, again, the culture of the organization has evolved. And that has also had its complexity. People that stay for a very long time and then suddenly leave because they just suddenly get fed up. And so there's lots of passive-aggressive dynamics within that organization. So, yeah, it's interesting.
So is there a right answer and a right way of team building?
It's a good question. I think the idea of team building has so many permutations that I think fundamentally it's about building a community within the business. And so to think about the fact that employees mostly come for a paycheck, but because they spend 80% of their living awake time in a place, we have to consider what it means to belong somewhere. And so team building is really about facilitating an aspect of belonging to something. And most employees, when they feel like they belong and they make meaning in the place that they spend a lot of their time, they stay, they generally are more productive, they experience their work as meaningful and rewarding in a more intrinsic way as opposed to just a financial transaction. So team building and training, I like to kind of maybe infuse those two. And again, if we think about sporting analogies, if you think of the teams that perform the best, they're the ones that are cohesed. They trust each other. They understand each other's strengths and weaknesses. They know when to stand up for each other or to fill in for each other when someone's tired or injured. There's so much awareness and empathy and connection and trust. And so team building, there's no right way of doing it. There are lots of ways in which one can facilitate team building, but I think having the elements of building trust, of building belonging, of building a sense of meaning in the workplace beyond the task, all of those things are what facilitates loyalty, commitment, and, obviously connection to the long-term vision.
So I hear what you're saying about everything that the employee needs to be feeling and experiencing within the culture of the business. Now, in order for that to happen, surely you've got to use some sort of standardized method of making sure that everyone in the team will gel and be cohesive. So surely that's where the psychometric testing helps, because then okay, for this position, I do need somebody who's more task orientated, but I need them to be able to feel part of this culture and fit into the culture, because otherwise you are going to have disconnect. So am I right in thinking that way?
Yeah, so some psychometric tools will measure behavior. So like, is this person more task oriented or not? But other tools are really powerful in terms of measuring motivation. And those two things are different. And people often misconstrue behavior for motivation, when actually what motivates someone is often different from the way they behave. And so thinking about different people's motivations for doing things is really useful. But that does require a little more, it's a more complex thing, and requires, I suppose, a little bit more awareness and paying attention to that. And some of the more advanced organizations do make use of those kinds of tools, but there's also resources and capacity for that. So it's not always possible to necessarily do that in the early phases of starting a business. But I think what's key is that the business owner begins to understand that about themselves first. So starting with your own self-awareness, your own motivation, understanding how you function, what regulates you, how do you then react in certain circumstances. The better a business owner understands themselves, the more aware they can be of others when they're employing them. And so, there are tools for that, but again, that requires quite specialist intervention.
Great.
I'm wondering about your experience just in terms of navigating not knowing and then figuring out and learning to use some of these tools.
Yeah, so initially I just went on competency, like in terms of how, and actually demonstration of wanting to learn as much as possible and be the best within that profession. So if I could see the will to really, really be good at what you were doing, then that is attractive to me in terms of a potential employee. So that's traditionally how I've gone with CVs, and also if they played a team sport at university or at school, then that's a non-negotiable for me. Everyone has to be a team player. So that was something that I always looked at. So it was to do with their taking the time and effort to learn outside of their teaching environment. So going on weekends and learning extra techniques or extra ways of doing things, so that one, and then making sure that they were used to being in a team environment.
So you're really looking for people who are willing and have an appetite for learning and growing. So a growth mindset, really. But also you're identifying a key thing that your business requires, which is team participation and willingness to show up. And it's a lovely way to actually measure that as to whether they have that built into them from a young age through sport and play. And so that's a really easy way to get that indicator, is whether they've participated in something in the past and, how they experienced that. It's a lovely assessment tool, actually. And that you've just come up with, you've figured that out. You don't need a psychometric tool to measure that. And so
no, that's true.
Using your own intuition as well.
Yeah. And also I think because that you've got interests outside of just going to school or going to university, you've got to, for me, it just shows that there's something, you're multidimensional and not just doing one thing, trying to do one thing you need to be able to communicate with people, and you need to be able to deal with situations where you're perhaps in a confrontational situation where you need to be able to talk it out with somebody.
So one of the things that a lot of business owners often feel frustrated by when it comes to employment is this idea that I want to employ someone who can think for themselves and can get on with it without too much intervention or help or parenting or management. I don't want to have to micromanage. And so I often think, employees are different from entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs want employees to think more like them entrepreneurially.
Yeah.
And yet, if they were entrepreneurial, they would potentially be a competitor at some point. And I've wondered how you've kind of navigated that challenge.
So I know that there are two types of people. There are the people who are always going to be employed and the people who are probably going to do their own thing. And if you give the employee person who's going to stay employed, and if you give them protocols to follow and it's the same, like this is how we do things, then that usually works out. That solves the problem of you got to think for yourself or try and problem solve or try and come up with a lateral solution. So the use of systems and protocols is really nice for that kind of person, because then it's predictable and it's consistent. One of the things I really enjoy about the physio practices that I've got is my goal with when I employ somebody is to make sure that they can be practice owners one day. So I put everybody through what it's like to be a practice owner, and then I can see straight away who would be, this is for me, teach me more, what about this, what about that, and then the others just sit and they're happy to not do too much more that would lead them into that path. So and I think that's something that I can identify pretty quickly, because I think it's either in you or not in terms of that industry.
So what you're talking about is the system of identifying managers, potential managers, versus someone who will generally always either remain a specialist or a technician. And that often is where the person remains employed. Sometimes those people will move into a self-employed space where they are still a technician, but they're just earning enough to kind of pay for what they would be earning if they were employed. So they have a level of independence, but they're never really going to build something that's bigger than themselves. But what you're recognizing is you can offer people opportunities to maybe show up in a particular way, which helps you identify whether they are management or practice owner material. And that applies in every organization.
Yeah.
The other thing that you've mentioned is the value of having management systems in place, structures that facilitate productivity and competency. And when those things are in place, then you have a workforce that is delivering, is showing up, is on time, is doing the things that they're expected to do because there's a structure in place.
Yeah.
And that structure is a management system.
Yeah.
How have you played around with management systems? What have you begun to do to implement them? How have they worked for you in your business?
Yeah, so we've done a lot, and I think if you've got an SOP in place, then there's no question as to what needs doing. So it's just like, document it. This is how the process works. Document it. Make sure someone's accountable when they are supposed to implement that SOP. And it just makes life very easy in terms of keeping things controlled and consistent. So I have used a lot of systems. Some have been manual on pieces of paper, depending on the person. Some are digital. So I don't think a business should operate without anything. When you're starting up and it's just yourself, you start thinking about, when I need somebody, what are they going to need from me in order to be less reliant on me and know what to do. So that's really, really key, is to start thinking about what are the core things that you would like. If we were talking about a virtual assistant, so what are the core things the virtual assistant would need from me? what would it look like? How can I organize my request to that virtual assistant so that there's no backwards and forwards of email saying, I don't understand this, what does this mean? So I would definitely start thinking about it, whether you're starting out or if you're already 5 years in and you don't have these things, and you need to start tidying up your processes, then putting systems in place and SOPs is really important.
So most people might not know what SOPs are, so maybe you can define that a little bit.
Yeah, so it's just a standard operation procedure. So it is the way a task would be done by an individual, or a workflow that you would need with a couple of team members in order for something to get done. So it's really a system that is like a template that everybody uses, so that if you've got change of staff, the new staff have a reference and they can automatically go to this template and say, I know exactly what I need to do. I don't need to go and ask somebody. It's all here. It's my blueprint. I know exactly what's going on and how to do it, when to do it.
So that's one of the things that a lot of businesses don't think about. But in terms of building a business, you want to employ people into an existing structure or system. So it's kind of the idea of what happens when a child is born into a family where there's already an existing way of doing things. There's a home, there's a culture, there's particular habits that the family have. And so the child gets born into that and then begins to just function in line with those rules. And a business is exactly the same. When you create an environment that has structure and systems, and then you employ someone into that, they become like that. A lot of the time in the early stages of business is that there's chaos. The business owner's doing everything, then you realize you need help, so you employ someone else, but you're employing them into a non-structured dynamic.
Yeah.
And so that's often where problems begin, is that someone is left almost in an abdicated way to figure the next thing out.
Yeah.
And that's often where the business can get quite fragmented. And
Yeah.
so your idea of having standard operating procedures that you employ someone into is absolutely critical.
Yeah.
And what that requires is that you create effectively, the starting point is just checklists for everything that needs to be done. That's like your basic system.
Yeah.
Is for this job, this thing needs to be done. So that when you're employing someone into that, you already know what kind of a person you need for that particular role. And then over time, that just gets multiplied into eventually operating manuals for your business.
Yeah, so it can be really simple. And so if you're in the process of going, I can't manage to do the checklist and just keep this business running, it's, just use a voice to text tool and just put your ideas down and then order them like that. And then just at least start with something, because this person's performance is going to be impacted by the amount of training that they get. So your documentation of SOPs is really just the beginning, so that they can at least start on the right track and not go down the wrong track. And then you're just crawling your way back out of a situation, and then they're deemed as not performing, but you haven't even trained them properly in the first place.
So, we've kind of bounced around into a number of different directions today, but I think it just highlights the enormous amount of attention that needs to be paid to people within business, because ultimately we require multiplication of ourselves in order for a business to grow. And yes, there need to be systems in place, but we also need people who operate those systems. And so thinking about how your business grows and when it grows, what kinds of people do you want to be operating the systems that you have in place, means you have to have thought about the systems first and put some sort of structure around those systems. And then, of course, as the business grows, you're having people managing people. And so that is also where it becomes very complicated, is where you're delegating to managers who are delegating. And that's ultimately a replication of that first sort of micro decision that you make around what do I want this organization to operate like.
Yeah.
I often come across businesses who have been operating for a number of years with loads of people in them, and there's still chaos. And so there's nothing wrong with going back to sort of basics and beginning to implement these things as if you were a startup. And that's often how it works. It's more retroactive than proactive. But it's possible to develop systems and proper management structures in a business even, years down the line. And that will always be beneficial.
Thanks for joining us on Becoming the Business. We hope today gave you something to chew on or talk about with someone you trust.
And if you're building something real, don't do it alone. We'll see you next time.